My beloved child. Stop scrolling for a moment. Something is waiting for you here. Not a promise that the future is already written. Not a prediction that you must believe. This is a fictional spiritual story, created to speak to the emotions we sometimes carry silently, the kind of story that feels like a message arriving at exactly the moment your heart needs to hear it. So pause here. Take a breath. And imagine that somewhere tonight, the person you call your soulmate is sitting alone with their phone in their hand. They have been staring at your name for several minutes. They have opened your conversation. Closed it. Opened it again. Typed something. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted it again. And finally, after fighting with themselves for longer than they want to admit, they begin writing the words they have been afraid to say. I need to tell you what happened today. They stop. Their heart is beating faster. Because those words sound simple. But behind them is an entire day of confusion, realization, regret, and emotion. And there is something they haven't told you yet. Something happened today that made them realize they can no longer keep pretending that everything inside them is fine. Maybe you thought they had moved on. Maybe you thought they stopped caring. Maybe you convinced yourself that their silence was an answer. Maybe you stopped expecting anything from them because waiting had become too painful. But in this story, today was different. Today, something brought your name back into their heart with a force they could not ignore. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was almost ordinary. A normal conversation. A normal place. A normal moment. And then someone said something that made them freeze. Your name came up. And suddenly, everything changed. They tried to remain calm. They tried to act like it didn't matter. But inside, something opened. A memory returned. Not just any memory. A memory of you. A moment they had replayed many times but never fully understood. They remembered the way you looked at them. The way you tried to hide what you were feeling. The words you said. And, most importantly, the words you didn't say. For the first time, they wondered whether they had misunderstood your silence. That question stayed with them. They carried it through the rest of the day. While other people talked, they were thinking. While they smiled, they were remembering. While they tried to focus on ordinary responsibilities, their mind kept returning to the same question. What if I was wrong about them? That question was uncomfortable. Because if they were wrong, then they had to reconsider everything. The distance. The silence. The decisions. The moments when they walked away. The moments when they could have reached out but didn't. The moments when they convinced themselves that you didn't care. And slowly, something painful began to become clear. Maybe you had been hurting too. Maybe you had been waiting too. Maybe you had been protecting your heart just as much as they were protecting theirs. And maybe two people who cared about each other had spent too much time waiting for the other person to make the first move. That realization hit them harder than they expected. Because suddenly, the past didn't look the same anymore. They remembered a particular day. A conversation between you. You had said something simple. At the time, they didn't understand why you said it. Now they did. You weren't trying to pressure them. You weren't demanding anything. You were simply trying to tell them that you needed honesty. And they gave you silence. They thought silence would protect them. Instead, it created distance. They thought avoiding the conversation would make things easier. Instead, it left both of you with questions. And today, those questions came back. Your soulmate realized something that people often discover too late. You cannot create peace by avoiding the truth. You can create temporary silence. You can create distance. You can pretend. You can distract yourself. You can fill your days with work, people, entertainment, responsibilities, and endless noise. But when the world becomes quiet, the truth waits. And today, the world became quiet for them. Even though they were surrounded by people, emotionally they felt alone. They wanted to tell someone what they were feeling. But they didn't know how. Because how do you explain that one person's name can still affect you after so much time? How do you explain that you thought you were finished with something, only to realize you never actually finished it? How do you explain regret without sounding like you're asking for forgiveness? How do you explain love without knowing whether the other person still wants to hear it? So they said nothing. At first. But then something happened. Someone showed them something. Maybe it was an old photograph. Maybe it was a message. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe it was simply a conversation that revealed something they had never known. Whatever form it took, it gave them a new perspective. They discovered that you had been carrying more than they realized. They discovered that something you had done quietly had actually meant much more than they understood. And suddenly they remembered all the times you helped without asking for recognition. The times you stayed calm when you could have walked away. The times you gave them space. The times you protected their feelings even while your own feelings were hurting. And they wondered why they had never noticed. Then came the realization that hurt the most. You had never been asking them to be perfect. You had only wanted them to be honest. And they had been afraid of honesty. Not because you were dangerous. Because honesty would make them vulnerable. It would force them to admit that they cared. It would force them to admit that you mattered. It would force them to admit that losing you affected them. And they were not ready for that. So they did what many people do when they are afraid. They became distant. They acted colder than they felt. They pretended not to care. They convinced themselves that they were protecting their peace. But sometimes what we call peace is simply avoidance. And today they understood that. They looked at your name again. Their finger moved toward the message box. They typed. I need to tell you what happened today. Then they stopped. They wanted to say more. They wanted to explain everything at once. But they knew that one message couldn't carry all of it. So they took a breath. And they continued. Something happened today that made me realize I have been looking at us the wrong way. They stared at the sentence. Then they added. I don't know if you still want to hear from me. That sentence hurt them. Because they suddenly realized they had no right to assume you would welcome them back into your emotional world. They had been absent. They had been confusing. They had left questions unanswered. So now they were afraid of the possibility that you had finally healed. What if you no longer wanted explanations? What if you had already closed the door? What if their message arrived too late? For a moment, they almost stopped. Then they remembered something. They remembered how many times they had wished they could go back and speak honestly. And they realized that waiting for the perfect moment had already cost them enough. So they continued. I don't expect you to fix anything for me. They paused. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. Another pause. I just need you to know the truth. Their hands became still. Because now they were reaching the part they had avoided. They were about to explain what really happened. Why they changed. Why they pulled away. Why they sometimes seemed close and then disappeared. And the answer was not what you might have imagined. There wasn't another perfect person who replaced you. There wasn't some secret reason designed to make you feel less important. There wasn't a hidden story in which you were somehow not enough. The real reason was much more painful. They were afraid. Afraid that if they allowed themselves to love you completely, they would eventually lose you. Afraid that if they depended on you emotionally, you would one day decide you didn't need them. Afraid that if they showed you their weaknesses, you would see them differently. So they tried to control the situation. They thought distance would give them power. Instead, distance made them lonely. They thought silence would make them less vulnerable. Instead, silence made them regretful. They thought walking away would make their feelings disappear. Instead, it made them realize how deeply those feelings had already settled inside them. And today, something finally broke through that wall. They realized that they had been protecting themselves from a possibility that had not even happened. They were afraid of being abandoned. So they created abandonment. They were afraid of being rejected. So they rejected the connection first. They were afraid of losing control. So they controlled their emotions until they lost something precious. That realization was devastating. They sat quietly. And for the first time, they didn't blame circumstances. They didn't blame timing. They didn't blame you. They looked at themselves. And they asked, "What did I do?" The answer was difficult. They had allowed fear to speak louder than love. They had allowed pride to speak louder than honesty. They had allowed assumptions to speak louder than communication. And now they were living with the consequences. But something else happened today. Something that gave them courage. They learned that you had not been as unaffected as they assumed. Perhaps they discovered that you had once waited for them. Perhaps someone told them that you had spoken about them with care. Perhaps they saw something you posted. Perhaps they simply remembered the way you looked at them the last time you were together. Whatever it was, it made them realize something. You had feelings too. And suddenly their old story collapsed. They had spent so much time believing that you didn't care because you weren't chasing them. But they finally understood that silence can come from pain too. Sometimes someone stops reaching out because they have already reached out too many times. Sometimes someone becomes quiet because they are tired of wondering whether they are wanted. Sometimes the strongest looking person is the one who has cried privately more than anyone knows. And your soulmate began wondering if that had been you. That thought broke through their pride. They didn't want to lose another day. They didn't want another misunderstanding. They didn't want another opportunity to pass. So they started writing again. I know I may have confused you. I know I may have hurt you. I know I may have made you question whether you ever mattered to me. Then they stopped. They stared at the words. And finally wrote. You did. 3 letters. 1 truth. You mattered. You mattered when they were silent. You mattered when they were distant. You mattered when they pretended to be unaffected. You mattered even when they acted like they had moved on. And that was the truth they had been avoiding. But there was more. They didn't only want to tell you that you mattered. They wanted to explain what happened today. Because today wasn't simply the day they remembered you. It was the day they realized they could no longer keep lying to themselves. Something had happened during their day that made them question the direction of their life. Maybe someone around them announced an engagement. Maybe someone close to them started a new chapter. Maybe they witnessed a relationship that reminded them of what they once imagined with you. Maybe they were asked a simple question. Are you happy? And they couldn't answer immediately. Because happiness is complicated when there is an unresolved truth inside you. They realized that being busy isn't the same as being fulfilled. Having people around you isn't the same as feeling understood. Moving forward isn't always the same as healing. And forgetting someone's name isn't the same as forgetting what they meant. They had tried to move forward. But today they understood they were still carrying an unfinished conversation. And unfinished conversations have weight. They sit quietly inside us. They appear when we least expect them. They return when we are finally quiet enough to hear them. Today, your soulmate heard that conversation again. And this time, they listened. They remembered something you once told them. You don't have to be perfect. Just be honest. Those words suddenly became powerful. Because that was all you had ever asked. Honesty. And they had spent so much time avoiding it. So they decided to give it to you. Not as a demand. Not as a manipulation. Not as a promise that everything would automatically become perfect. Just the truth. They continued typing. What happened today made me realize I have been carrying something I should have told you long ago. Then came the confession. I was never as unaffected as I acted. They stopped. Their eyes filled with emotion. Because that sentence contained years of pretending. I missed you. They deleted it. Then typed it again. I missed you. This time they kept it. I thought I could make myself stop caring. I couldn't. I thought time would erase everything. It didn't. I thought distance would make me feel free. It made me understand what I lost. Their hands were trembling slightly. But they continued. And today I realized something else. They looked at the screen. They knew this was the moment. The moment they had been avoiding. The moment that would make the entire message real. They wrote. I wasn't angry with you. Then. I was afraid of how much you mattered to me. That was it. The truth. Simple. Painful. Human. They finally understood that the connection had scared them because it had reached a part of their heart they had kept protected for a long time. They weren't used to needing anyone. They weren't used to being emotionally seen. They weren't used to someone noticing the things they tried to hide. And you had noticed. You had seen through them. That frightened them. But secretly, it was also what they wanted. To be known. To be understood. To be accepted without pretending. And now they were wondering if they had pushed away the one person who had actually seen them clearly. That thought brought tears. Not because they expected you to return. But because they finally understood what their behavior had cost. They knew an apology wouldn't erase everything. They knew one message couldn't repair months or years of confusion. They knew they couldn't demand another chance. So they wrote something different. I don't know what happens after you read this. I don't know whether you'll answer. I don't know whether you still have space for me in your life. But I don't want fear to make this decision for me again. That sentence stayed on the screen. And for the first time that day, they felt calm. Not because they knew the outcome. Because they had finally chosen honesty over control. They had finally said what they needed to say. But they weren't finished. There was still one final thing. The thing that had happened earlier that day. The thing that started this entire message. The discovery. The conversation. The realization. They needed to tell you about it. So they wrote. Today someone said something about you. They stopped. Then continued. They didn't know how much it would affect me. They told me something I didn't know. Your soulmate took a deep breath. Because this was the part they had been trying to understand all day. They had discovered that something you did quietly had affected their life more than they realized. Perhaps you had defended them when they weren't there. Perhaps you had protected their reputation. Perhaps you had refused to speak badly about them even when you were hurt. Perhaps someone told them that you had once been given an opportunity to walk away completely, but you chose not to destroy what remained. Whatever the exact detail, it changed their perspective. They realized that you had been carrying the connection differently than they had assumed. You weren't demanding. You weren't chasing. You weren't trying to control their life. You were simply trying to protect something that mattered to you. And perhaps that was why the connection had remained in their mind. Because real emotional bonds don't always survive through constant communication. Sometimes they survive through meaning. A person can disappear from your daily life and still remain part of your emotional history. And today, your soulmate understood the difference. They finally understood that what mattered wasn't how often you spoke. It was what remained when you didn't. And what remained was not hatred. Not indifference. Not emptiness. There was still care. Still tenderness. Still unfinished emotion. But this time, they didn't want to romanticize it. They wanted to understand it. They wanted to know who you had become. They wanted to know whether you were okay. They wanted to know whether the person they remembered was still there. And more importantly, they wanted to know whether they could speak to you without causing another wound. That was why their message was urgent. Not because some disaster was coming. Not because you needed to be afraid. But because emotional opportunities can disappear quietly. A conversation can become impossible. A person can heal and close a door. A moment can pass. And your soulmate realized they didn't want fear to make another decision for them. So they wrote. I need to tell you what happened today. Then. I finally understood something. Then. You were never the problem. They paused. And tears finally came. Because sometimes the most painful apology isn't, I'm sorry for leaving. It's, I'm sorry I made you believe you weren't worth staying for. They typed those words. Then sat there. For several seconds, they didn't move. The room around them was quiet. The phone screen was the only light. And suddenly they remembered the beginning. The first time you made them feel safe. The first time they laughed with you without pretending. The first time they realized you were different. The first time they became afraid of losing you. They realized something beautiful and painful. The same person who made them feel safe also made them feel vulnerable. And because they didn't know how to handle vulnerability, they mistook it for danger. That was their mistake. Not yours. And perhaps that is one of the deepest lessons hidden inside this story. Sometimes the person we push away isn't the person who hurt us. Sometimes we push away the person who accidentally touched the wound someone else created. We react to today's person using yesterday's pain. And then we wonder why we lost something beautiful. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that. They couldn't change the past. But they could finally stop repeating it. They could stop hiding. They could stop assuming. They could stop making decisions on your behalf. They could finally tell you the truth and allow you to decide what it meant for you. That was the most mature thing they could do. So they wrote the final part of their message. I don't want to ask you for anything. I don't want to pressure you. I don't want to make you responsible for my feelings. I only want to give you the truth you deserved from me a long time ago. Then they wrote. I cared. I still care. And I was scared. They looked at the message. It was the simplest confession they had ever written. No dramatic promises. No unrealistic future. No attempt to manipulate your emotions. Just 3 truths. I cared. I still care. I was scared. And then came the sentence that made them finally press send. I hope someday you understand that my distance was never proof that you meant nothing. They paused. Then added. Sometimes my distance was proof that I didn't know what to do with how much you meant. They read everything from the beginning. Their eyes moved slowly over each line. They considered deleting it. For one final second, fear returned. What if you rejected them? What if you ignored them? What if you had already moved on? What if the truth came too late? Then they remembered what happened today. They remembered the realization. They remembered how close they had come to losing the courage again. And they decided something. Whatever happened next, they would rather live with an honest answer than another lifetime of unanswered questions. Their finger moved. The message was sent. For a moment, nothing happened. No response. No typing bubble. No sign that you had seen it. They placed the phone down. They stood up. Walked across the room. Came back. Picked it up again. Still nothing. And then they realized something important. The outcome was no longer theirs to control. They had done their part. They had finally spoken. Now you had the right to choose. And that is where the story becomes deeper than a soulmate reunion. Because love is not always about getting the person you want. Sometimes love is about becoming honest enough to stop manipulating the outcome. Sometimes healing is not someone coming back. Sometimes healing is finally understanding why they left. Sometimes closure is an apology. Sometimes it is silence. And sometimes two people discover that what they truly needed was not a perfect ending, but the courage to finally tell the truth. In this story, your soulmate has reached that point. They have finally understood what happened today. They realized that the biggest urgency was not outside them. It was inside. They were running out of excuses. Running out of reasons to remain silent. Running out of ways to convince themselves that they didn't care. And the most surprising discovery was this. They were not actually waiting for you to save them. They were waiting for themselves to become brave enough to stop hiding. And today, they did. Maybe their message will lead to another conversation. Maybe it will lead to forgiveness. Maybe it will lead to a new beginning. Maybe it will simply give you both the closure you deserved. But whatever happens next, the truth has finally entered the room. And once truth enters, nothing remains exactly the same. So if this fictional story feels personal, let it remind you of something important. Don't confuse silence with worth. Don't measure your value by someone's ability to communicate. Don't chase someone simply because they are afraid. Don't abandon your boundaries because someone finally realizes what they lost. And don't spend your life waiting for another person's courage. Your heart deserves honesty. Your peace deserves protection. Your future deserves space. If someone truly wants to be part of your life, let their actions eventually support their words. Let consistency speak. Let respect speak. Let accountability speak. Let healing speak. Because real love isn't proven by dramatic messages. It is proven by what happens after the message. And perhaps that is the most important part of what your soulmate learned today. Words can open a door. But actions determine whether that door is safe to walk through. So imagine the phone lying quietly on the table. The message has been sent. Your soulmate is sitting there. They don't know what tomorrow will bring. But for the first time, they are not hiding from it. They have admitted the truth. They have acknowledged the pain. They have accepted responsibility. And they have released the need to control your response. Their heart is still nervous. But underneath the nervousness is something new. Peace. Not the peace of knowing everything will work out exactly as they want. The peace of knowing they finally stopped running from the truth. And somewhere else, perhaps you are reading those words. Maybe your heart is racing. Maybe you're confused. Maybe you're emotional. Maybe you are remembering your own version of the story. Maybe you are asking yourself whether people can truly change. And the answer is not something anyone else can give you. You have to watch. You have to observe. You have to protect your heart while allowing people the opportunity to prove themselves. Because forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You can forgive someone and still choose distance. You can care about someone and still choose yourself. You can understand why someone hurt you without volunteering to be hurt again. That is strength. That is maturity. That is healing. And if this fictional message has found an emotional place inside you, perhaps the real message is not about waiting for your soulmate. Perhaps it is about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs someone else's uncertainty to determine their worth. You were valuable before they recognized it. You were worthy before they understood it. You were enough before they became brave enough to admit it. And if someone returns, let them return with clarity. If someone apologizes, let their behavior support the apology. If someone says they care, let consistency prove it. If someone says they changed, give time the opportunity to reveal whether that change is real. Do not rush. Do not chase. Do not abandon yourself. Let truth unfold naturally. And perhaps, in this story, that is exactly what happened today. Your soulmate didn't suddenly become perfect. They simply became honest. They finally looked at the truth they had been avoiding. They finally understood that their fear had consequences. They finally realized that you were not asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. And finally, they gave it. Their final message remains on the screen. I need to tell you what happened today. But now you understand what those words really meant. They didn't simply mean something happened outside. Something happened inside them. They changed the way they understood the past. They changed the way they understood you. They changed the way they understood themselves. And sometimes that is where every real emotional transformation begins. Not with another person. With the moment we finally become honest with ourselves. So breathe. Let the story settle. Whatever your own situation may be, don't allow someone else's silence to become the narrator of your life. Your story is bigger than one unanswered message. Bigger than one relationship. Bigger than one person's inability to express what they feel. And if someone is meant to remain in your life, they will have to meet you with honesty, respect, effort, and consistency, not simply emotion. That is the difference between a moment and a meaningful connection. That is the difference between longing and love. That is the difference between returning and truly coming back. And in this fictional story, tonight was not the night everything became perfect. It was the night the pretending stopped. The night fear lost its control. The night a person finally admitted, I cared. I still care. And I was scared. The message has been delivered. The truth has been spoken. The decision is no longer hidden inside silence. And whatever happens next, both hearts finally have something they did not have before. Clarity. Sometimes that is the miracle we were actually waiting for. Not a guaranteed reunion. Not a perfect ending. Just the courage to finally know the truth. And as the night becomes quiet, your soulmate places the phone beside them. They close their eyes. For the first time in a long time, they don't replay what they should have said. Because they finally said it. They don't imagine every possible future. Because they understand that the future belongs to both people. They don't chase an answer. They simply wait. Not helplessly. Not desperately. But with acceptance. And somewhere inside that acceptance is a quiet realization. If you answer, they will listen. If you need time, they will respect it. If you forgive, they will understand that forgiveness must be earned again through actions. And if you choose yourself, they will finally understand that loving someone also means respecting their freedom to choose. That is where the story ends. Not with a fantasy. Not with a promise. But with two people finally standing in the truth. One has spoken. The other has the right to decide. And perhaps that is the most beautiful ending of all. Because sometimes the greatest spiritual lesson is not that someone is destined to return. It is that you are finally strong enough to stop waiting for someone to validate what your heart already knows about your own worth. You deserve honesty. You deserve peace. You deserve consistency. You deserve love that does not make you constantly question where you stand. And if someone comes toward you, let them come with truth. Let them come with accountability. Let them come with actions. Let them come without games. Because your heart was never meant to survive on promises alone. It was meant to experience something real. Something steady. Something respectful. Something that does not require you to lose yourself in order to keep another person. So if today feels like an ending, let it be an ending to confusion. If today feels like a beginning, let it be a beginning built on honesty. And if today simply reminds you of someone you once loved, let the memory exist without allowing it to control your future. You don't have to chase what is meant for you. You don't have to force what is uncertain. You don't have to prove that you are worthy. You already are. And somewhere in this fictional story, the phone screen finally goes dark. The message remains there. The truth remains there. The past remains where it belongs. And tomorrow, both people get to decide what they will do with what they now know. That is the real beginning. Not the beginning of a guaranteed reunion. The beginning of clarity. The beginning of honesty. The beginning of choosing love without abandoning yourself. And perhaps, after everything they wrote tonight, there is only one sentence left. Not a promise. Not a prediction. Just a truth. Sometimes the message we have been waiting to receive isn't meant to tell us who will come back. It is meant to remind us that we should never again lose ourselves while waiting for someone to find the courage to speak. And tonight, the silence finally ended.